Dear friends, welcome to another episode of Geopolitical and Military News. In this video, we will talk about the flame-throwing drones that are beginning to be used in Ukraine to try to break the deadlock of trench warfare. When World War I began in Europe in July 1914, it was believed to be just another European conflict, like so many others. And that, as had happened in the past, the conflict would be brief, and by Christmas, everything would be resolved, with the men returning to their families. However, by Christmas of that year, the situation on the front line was in a terrible stalemate, with millions of soldiers literally bogged down in thousands of kilometers of hastily dug trenches across Europe. The main reason for this was the rapid emergence of new weapons at the beginning of the 20th century. Before World War I, the last major conflict in the world had been the American Civil War, a conflict that began in 1861 and lasted until 1865, resulting in over 600,000 deaths and 500,000 wounded. But despite the scale of that conflict, with 3.5 million soldiers fighting on a continental territory, the tactics and weapons used were not so different from those employed 100 years earlier. However, less than 50 years after the end of that conflict, when World War I began, industrial and technological advancements had led to the birth of truly revolutionary weapons, particularly light and portable machine guns, as well as howitzers and artillery pieces with greater range and rate of fire, and most importantly, capable of firing shells with explosive warheads. In the past, cannons acted more or less like large bowling balls thrown against enemy lines in the hope of hitting as many soldiers as possible. But in World War I, that had changed radically with the advent of explosive warheads, which, as the name suggests, exploded on impact, spreading a massive and lethal cloud of fragments, which could also injure or even kill just from the shockwave. But despite the advancement in technology and weapons, military commanders' strategies remained the same as those of the 19th century. This combination of outdated tactics against highly lethal automatic weapons resulted in extremely high casualty rates among soldiers. Therefore, with so many machine gun shots and artillery shrapnel crossing the battlefield, soldiers were literally pushed into the depths of wet and unsanitary trenches, beginning in mid-September 1914, the so-called trench warfare, which caused a tremendous deadlock in the conflict, with neither side able to make significant advances. For years, armies searched for ways to break this deadlock, and the first really effective step in that direction was taken in September 1916, with the appearance of the combat tank, a British innovation that caught the Germans completely by surprise, spreading panic through their lines. The British were only unable to definitively break the stalemate of the trenches due to numerous mechanical problems with the tanks. But when they worked well, they managed to create small breaches in the enemy trenches that could be exploited by infantry following right behind. In 1939, when World War II began, the dynamics of warfare were radically different, with armies prioritizing mobility on the battlefield through vehicles and tanks with much superior autonomy and mechanical reliability, allowing maneuvers of dozens of kilometers per day by units formed by tens or even hundreds of thousands of soldiers, something unimaginable just 20 years earlier. For this reason, all this speed and agility greatly reduced the importance and relevance of trenches. Although they were used in World War II, they played more of a support role, and almost always from a short-term perspective. After all, it made no sense to spend time and effort building large and complex trenches when the enemy could simply bypass them and encircle everything with vehicle and tank maneuvers. Because of this, throughout the second half of the 20th century and the early 21st century, trenches remained as complementary defensive methods, almost always inserted into a mobile and dynamic defensive strategy. This began to change in February 2022 with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Despite the highly mechanized and mobile forces of both Russia and Ukraine, the mobile phase of the conflict effectively ended in May 2022, just 3 months after the war began, with Russia no longer able to advance with the same speed and determination, starting a slow war of attrition and exhaustion, marked by advances and retreats that were generally very modest. a type of conflict in which trenches were once again used in full force, something evident during the Ukrainian offensive launched in June 2023. As many remember, that offensive had as its main objective the Zaporozhye region. However, the delay in launching the attack, combined with the absence of Ukrainian air support, resulted in the failure of the operation, with the Ukrainians facing hundreds of kilometers of Russian trenches. Of course, the use of trenches is not exclusive to the Russians, as the Ukrainians, who are largely in a defensive position, also use trenches to block the Russian advance in some sectors. All these trenches contributed to the creation of a great deadlock at some points on the front line. Thus, just as happened in World War I when armies sought ways to break the trench warfare stalemate, now both Russians and Ukrainians are also seeking ways to overcome it, using drones as weapons. Thanks to drones, trenches began to be attacked from above, with small grenades spreading panic among the entrenched, leading armies to dig trenches in wooded areas, using the natural protection of trees as an extra shield against drones. In these narrow strips of woodland between agricultural fields, small units of 100 to 200 soldiers armed with machine guns, missiles, and anti-tank RPGs can remain entrenched and fighting for days or weeks. To address this, the Ukrainians came up with the idea of flame-throwing drones, large-scale equipment with high payload capacity, armed with thermite, a pyrotechnic compound of powder and metallic oxide that, when ignited, generates an absurdly high amount of heat, around 1,700 degrees Celsius, enough to cause fires that, if not immediately controlled, can lead to the detonation of ammunition stored in the area. There are several videos circulating on social media showing drones dropping thermite on the ammunition of entrenched troops. It is yet another deadly innovation in a war that unfortunately shows no signs of ending anytime soon. Thank you for watching the video until the end. If you liked the content, don't forget to leave a like. This helps the channel grow and reach more people. If you didn't like it, leave a dislike and explain in the comments how we can improve. Also, comment with suggestions for topics we can cover in future videos. Insulting comments or those defending dictatorships or war criminals will be blocked without exception. Thank you for your understanding. If you're not yet subscribed to the channel, consider subscribing by clicking the subscribe button below and hitting the bell to receive all notifications. Thank you. See you next time.